Vivek Ramaswamy, Van Jones, and Confession Through Projection.
Sending way that he just spews this poison out is very, very dangerous because he won't stop Trump, but he's going to outlive Trump by about 50 years. And you're watching the rise of an American demagogue that is a very, very despicable person.
Yeah.
And I was shaking listening to him talk because a lot of people don't know that is one step away from Nazi propaganda coming out of his mouth.
So a few weeks ago, Van Jones on CNN told the world that Vivek Ramaswamy is a dangerous demagogue whose rhetoric is almost on par with Nazi propaganda. So let that sink in. Van Jones, of all people, coming out and calling somebody else a demagogue. The race-baiting huckster himself coming out, oh, these people are engaging in demagoguery. The left in this country is often a parody of itself. So that's what we're going to get into in this video. First of all, what's demagoguery? If you want to have a discussion, it's always good to lay the groundwork by defining what you're talking about. So let's talk about what demagoguery is. And actually, probably a better way to start would be to contrast it with the opposite of demagoguery. So the opposite of demagoguery would be calmly going through the facts and evidence, and then with reason building a case for whatever your policy happens to be. Starting with first principles. Okay, what is our value that we're trying to protect or work towards? And based on the reason and evidence and with a focus on results, what's the best way to get there? That would be the intelligent way to try to persuade people to your way of seeing things or to your policy position. That would be the opposite of demagoguery. So that is demagoguery? Demagoguery is an appeal to emotion and prejudice just to try to work up a crowd into a frenzy. So instead of appealing to the intellect of people and trying to persuade them that way, you're going to appeal to their emotion. And you could say, well, all politicians are trying to appeal to people's emotions. So aren't they all demagogues? Well, here's how you spot the difference. A good persuasive argument is going to have three elements. If you're trying to convince somebody of the importance of adopting a certain public policy, you're going to appeal to ethics. You're going to define a value that you're trying to achieve. For example's sake, let's say free speech. So you're trying to craft some legislation to protect the exercise of free speech. Allowing people to express themselves openly in society is a good unto itself. So that's the ethical component. Then you're going to use reason to support it. Here are all the reasons why it's important to allow a society to express itself, to allow individuals to state their opinions and criticize public officials and public policy and argue for their point of view. And lastly, you can have an appeal to emotion in that. You can try to connect with people on an emotional level as well. If you've lived any length of time, there's probably a time in your life when you felt like you couldn't speak your mind for whatever reason. Maybe you were afraid of what your employer might say. Especially in today's cancel culture, you could be worried about losing your livelihood if you step out of line and say the wrong thing. You might be afraid of the reaction you might get. And that's a terrible feeling when you feel like you have something that's truthful and insightful and you want to say it, but you feel like you can't. Not for a good reason, but because somebody else will take it out of context and use it against you. Well, that's very stifling. So that would be an example of an issue where you can craft sort of ethics, reason, and emotion and make a good argument, a good case for why we need to protect something, say free speech in this example. How does that differ from demagoguery or the approach of a demagogue? Well, the demagogue focuses primarily on appeals to emotion, and reason and ethics, which should be the forefront of the argument, get pushed to the back seat if they're even come into the equation at all. So rather than building your argument on ethics and reason primarily and putting a little of emotion in there just to sort of connect with people, the demagogue is almost all emotion. It's all appeal to the prejudices of the audience that you're trying to manipulate. Prejudices, am I saying that right? Yeah, that word that my mouth doesn't like to pronounce correctly.
Prejudice. Prejudice.
what she said. So then again, what's the irony of Van Jones coming out and accusing Vivek Ramaswamy of being a demagogue? But the irony is that Van Jones engages in demagoguery all the time. In fact, you could certainly find examples of demagoguery on either side of the aisle. So, like, no side is perfectly squeaky clean on this, but Democrats in general, demagoguery is their whole stick. Appeals to emotion. That's all identity politics is demagoguery. You know, you get in front of this group and you tell them, oh, the world's unfair, everybody's against you. It's those other people over there. You know, whether it's along the lines of sex. Say the way they represent the gender pay gap would be a perfect example.
Some say there isn't really a gender pay gap. Well, that is just wrong. The typical woman working full-time in 2014 was paid 79% of what men were paid.
Over the course of her career, a working woman with a college degree will earn, on average, hundreds of thousands of dollars less than a man who does the same work.
Women are saying, Bernie, how does it happen that I work in an office, I work in a plant, and I get paid 79 cents on the dollar compared to the guy in the other office doing the same work? And you know what the answer to that question is? It is old-fashioned sexism. That's
demagoguery on display, and as late as 2016, you had Democrat hopefuls coming out and talking about the gender pay gap, intentionally trying to incite a reaction from women. Oh, the life's so unfair. We live in a patriarchy. Blah blah blah. You know, I'm sure in a nation of 330 million people, you can find some examples of sexism and where women are discriminated against. But you got to look at it on a case-by-case basis. The demagogue doesn't want to do that. They just want to say, like, there's a blanket of systemic sexism out there keeping women down. When you actually look at the gender pay gap, basically to get a 22 or 23% gender pay gap between males and females, you basically have to not control for any variables at all other than comparing the average full-time female and her earnings to the average full-time male, which doesn't account for real basic things like occupational choice. Like, if you actually compared men and women doing the same type of job, well, then the gender pay gap basically disappears. If you compare, like, male teachers to female teachers, there isn't a 22% gender pay gap between them. And you also got to control for things like total number of hours worked, which you think would be an obvious thing to control for, but if you do those two things, you control for occupational choice and total number of hours worked, well, then the gender pay gap disappears, and then you can't come out and say there's a 22% difference between what males and females work. So that would just be one example of Democrats in this country engaging in demagoguery. Race is another one, and that's, you know, the specialty of people like Van Jones. Rather than view people as individuals and judging them on their own merits, I mean, their whole shtick is lumping people together based on their immutable characteristics and then trying to manipulate those groups by appealing to commonly perceived injustices in those communities. Say, police brutality and how it affects the black community would be a good example. Now, you can look at the actual data and see that, you know, more white people are killed by police officers every year than are black people in America. And then you can break it down and look at individual cases where people are killed by the police, and you'll see that the vast majority of them are justified. It's people fighting with police, violently resisting arrest. Most of the people that are killed by police are armed when they're killed by police, and even in the cases where they're unarmed, a lot of times unarmed doesn't mean not dangerous. I mean, if you're taking swings at a guy's head, that's a potentially fatal situation. I mean, more people die in this country every year being struck with hands and feet than are killed by rifles in this country. And if you're wrestling with a cop, especially if you're reaching for his weapon, I mean, it definitely is still a dangerous situation, whether or not you happen to be armed at that moment or not. So again, you got to look at everything by a case-by-case basis and not view it through the prism of oh, I support the cops, so the cops are always right, or I'm black, so I'm always going to side with the black guy in an altercation between the police and a man who happens to be black. I mean, that's the stupid way to approach anything. You should look at the facts of the particular case. But demagoguery is more concerned with lumping people together and viewing everything in the light of identity. So where do I come up with the term confession through projection? I borrowed that term from Vivek, he was a Canadian attorney who now makes content on YouTube, but I've heard him use that term confession through projection a few times. Not sure if it's original to him, but that's where I got it from. Now, in psychological terms, projection is when you have feelings or attributes yourself, but for whatever reason, maybe your ego, in an attempt to protect itself, instead of like realizing that, hey, maybe you're not as good of a person as you think you are, you project those attributes out into the world. It's a way of projecting your emotional state or something about yourself onto somebody else, and then criticizing that. It takes the focus off of you. So think of maybe a con man who makes his living defrauding and swindling people, and he comments to people, you just can't trust people these days, because he's assuming everybody thinks and acts like he does. But this is on a subconscious level, and to protect his self-image, protect his own ego, he can't come to terms with his own faults, so he projects them out into the world and makes it about other people. I'm definitely not a trained psychologist, but that's sort of my interpretation of one of the ways that projection works in the psychological sense. And this is what Democrats do all the time. There's a saying that whenever you point your finger at somebody else, remember that there's 3 fingers pointing back at you. And this is something I observe in Democrats all the time. They're usually guilty 3 times over whatever they're accusing their Republican counterparts of. See, I'm a very cautious person. Before I accuse somebody of something, I want to make sure that, do some self-reflection and see, do I do the same thing? Because I don't want to be overly judgmental and end up condemning myself because I exhibit the same behavior. I don't think Democrats have that self-awareness, or at least a lot of them don't. Or maybe they do and they just don't care. There's different tiers of the party. There's obviously the rank and file, the people that just identify as Democrat voters and support the party, that really don't have any sway or political power. And then there's the upper echelons of the party, or the people that actually hold office, or they're closely connected with power in some way, have some influence over it. Maybe those people do know that they're acting hypocritically, they just don't care because they're motivated by things other than just trying to be a decent, consistent person. As younger, I'd see them engaging in hypocrisy, and I'd say, do they, maybe nobody's told them that they just said the opposite thing or took the opposite stance last week, and now they're singing a different tune. But as I grew older, I realized that more likely they just have a Machiavellian personality type, which meaning their highest value, the God that they serve, if you want to call it that, is power or the pursuit of power. They don't care about the truth. They don't care about fairness or any universal concept of justice. They just care about power and pursuing it. So they will say or do whatever is convenient in the moment. If it doesn't line up with what they did yesterday or the week prior, who cares? And, they get away with it because their voter base, I don't like to say they're stupid, because they might be perfectly functional and well adapted to other areas of their life, but my perception of the Democrat voter base is, as far as politics is concerned, they tend to have very low political IQs. They're the high emotion, low information voters in my view. And because of that, they're very susceptible to demagoguery. Those appeals to emotion appeal to them because they haven't sat and really thought out their own ideas very well. They haven't sorted out all the contradictions in their head and developed a coherent political philosophy. It's kind of just whatever trips their triggers in the moment, whatever makes them feel good. And often that's these emotionally charged arguments and demagoguery that they are fed by, the people in power that they support. But, I observed this sort of projection in my personal life. For example, I've got a couple of Democrat friends who are very vocal about their views and just like to vent on other people. And from listening to that, I've learned that, they tend to think the right is basically a cult. They think the Republican Party is pretty much in shambles, and all it is MAGA and QAnon. The ironic thing is, I myself am pretty libertarian, but I'm very between the two parties. I definitely would prefer a Republican over a Democrat. And I live in a very conservative area, so because I live in a very conservative area and I'm around conservative people, I sort of have a pulse on what they're actually like and what they actually talk about. Also, from time to time, I'll tune into the conservative AM radio stations. Not so much anymore, because mostly I'll listen to podcasts and things online rather than talk radio. But I never hear them talk about QAnon, for example. That's the big thing my Democrat friends think conservatives are all about. I don't hear any of them talking about QAnon. The only time I ever hear the term QAnon, it's some Democrat talking about what he thinks Republicans talk about or care about. And most of the people I know that support Trump do so pragmatically, and they often have plenty of criticisms of Trump. If nothing else, they don't like his style. They don't like his propensity to just tweet out random stuff that often distracts from more important stuff that we should be focused on. In fact, I can't think of anybody I know that just worships at the Trump's feet and he can do no wrong in their eyes. Most people are fairly pragmatic. He's the only, until Vivek Ramaswamy came around, he's the only anti-establishment candidate out there, at least that had a chance of winning. But it's just ironic, listening to these friends. It's like they lack any self-awareness. I mean, they accuse the people of who they disagree with of being all these crazy QAnon conspiracy theorists. I had one friend tell me, he could never vote for a Republican again because they believe the lie. They believe that the 2020 election was stolen. And I even said to him once, oh yeah, it's ridiculous to think the election was stolen, except for in 2016 when the Russians hacked the election for Trump and stole it from Hillary. And that's the thing. If you're going to accuse some Republicans of believing in crazy QAnon conspiracy theories, at least on the Republican side, that is way out on the fringe. You don't hear AM radio hosts talking about QAnon or anybody with any reach or sway. On the Democrat side, the Russia collusion conspiracy theory was mainstream. I mean, that's all MSNBC and CNN wanted to talk about for 2 or 3 years, and it all turned out to be nonsense. So that's what I see as confession through projection. People that lack a healthy introspection, they lack a lot of self-awareness, and they end up criticizing others for the stuff they do all the time. And people of any political persuasion could be like that, but I noticed it a lot more on the left. And someone who tends to be more introspective, I genuinely don't want to be a hypocrite. And maybe that's a sort of projection that I engage in myself. See, as somebody who tries not to be a hypocrite, who tries to say things that are as truthful as I can manage, because I have those values, I sort of project those on the world, and I expect other people to behave in kind. And when I see people just flagrantly acting like hypocrites and not even trying to be consistent, not gonna lie, I find that aggravating. So I guess I'll wrap this video up by saying, try not to be a hypocrite. Try not to confess your own sins by projecting them onto other people. Find that healthy balance where you're actually internally consistent. Unfortunately, that requires a level of humility and self-reflection that unfortunately a lot of people don't have in today's society.
That guy is dangerous. That's dangerous. When those people are saying Jews will not replace us, Jews will not replace us, that slogan sits on top of a very sick and twisted view that if you bring enough people of color here, we are so deficient, we are so stupid, we are so unwanted that we will be zombies to fill out the ranks for some Democratic Party agenda that Jewish people are manipulating and driving forward. That leads to violence. That puts at risk Jewish people. That puts at risk people of color. It is wrong. And the smug, condescending way that he just spews this poison out is very, very dangerous.
You know, I don't even know what he's talking about. I have never heard anybody say, the Jews will not replace us, until I heard it come out of Van Jones' mouth in this clip. You know, it's like QAnon. The only time I ever hear the term QAnon now is like when a Democrat is talking about it in the context that he thinks that's what Republicans talk about. Like, I live in a conservative area around a lot of people that support Trump, and if they don't support Trump, a lot of them like Vivek. And I've never heard any of them say anything about the Jews will not replace us. Now, in some obscure random corner of the internet, could you probably find something like that? I'm sure you could, but that doesn't mean it's at all representative of what is mainstream. I've certainly never heard Vivek say anything about the Jews will not replace us. So maybe Vivek had the right response initially when he told Van Jones to...
This character Van Jones on CNN afterwards saying, this is the rise of an American demagogue who's going to live 50 years longer than Trump. This is dangerous. I am shaking. That's what he says. Just shut the up. At a certain point, just shut the up.
You've been watching the Fletch Report. If you're hearing this, it means you've made it to the end of the video. But before you click onto the next thing and continue down whatever rabbit hole you're on YouTube or Rumble, I've got a small favor to ask. If you found value in my content and you want to help the channel out, the best thing you can do is share it with somebody else that you think will find value in it. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe if you want to see more. Links to the channel on YouTube and Rumble will be provided below. Additionally, I'm making a Facebook page for the channel as well as a X/formerly Twitter. Feel free to follow me on those platforms as well. If you're feeling exceptionally generous, provided in the description below will be a link to Buy Me a Coffee, which is the online equivalent of a tip jar. Thanks for watching, and thanks for supporting the channel.